for yet again putting together a fantastic um, discussion on a very important issue. And thank you to the listeners that are listening in on Facebook Live, as well as those that are on Zoom. And so for me, I think that, Senator Singleton said it best. This is a very important workshop or session that's going to give you information on how to exercise your right to vote, even though, although we're in the situation regarding the pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with it about where we're going to be, and whether it's the special election in July, or whether it's the elections, municipal and or November elections. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we want to make certain that you guys have an opportunity to exercise your right to vote from wherever you are. And so with that, I just want to thank you again for coming. I want to also thank a personal friend of mine, Ms. Christina Saunders, who I've known for a number of years, and the foundation for your interest in this a very important topic. And so I just want to thank you guys. Also, Ben, I know that this is sort of their brainchild, and thank you for putting this together and putting all of us together and really reaching out. And to the panelists that will be having this rich discussion about this, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share this very important information with us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Representative Gray. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader Daniels. Before we begin our presentation, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can post them in the chat or the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end. And so we'll get started now. Our first panelist that we'll go to is Rance Graham-Bailey, who is the Election Protection Manager for the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights Under Law, and his team. Welcome.
Hello, my name is Rance Graham-Bailey. I'm the Election Protection Manager for Lawyers Committees for Civil Rights. I have the privilege to work with a team of organizers, volunteers, attorneys, and coalition partners who ensure that everyone has the right to vote and that every vote counts. So I'm joined by my colleagues, China Baldwin and Marnie Eady. You'll hear from them shortly. And we collectively want to bring greetings from the leadership of the Lawyers Committee, Kristen Clark, our President and Executive Director, and Damon Hewitt, our Executive Vice President. I want to give thanks to Andrew Goodman Foundation for inviting us to take part in this panel, Senator Singleton, Representative Gray, and the Alabama Democratic Caucus for hosting, and also our fellow panelists. I think it's going to be a great presentation. So what I want to do on the next slide is share a little bit about what election protection is. And one more slide, please. So we want to share a little bit about what election protection is. We want to share about the impact that we've experienced in our national organizing that the pandemic has had on elections, and tie that into the experience that students are having, and also to the approach of advocacy. And then we want to kind of close out with some action items that you can take home, that you can push forth in your community and in your state. So on the next slide, you'll see that election protection, we are a national nonpartisan election protection coalition convened by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We work year-round to ensure that all voters have an equal opportunity to vote and have that vote count. We're made up of more than 200 local partners, state and national partners, and we use a wide range of tools to do that, to protect, advance, and defend the right to vote, including the 866 Our Vote voter hotline. You can call that and find out information, and go to 866ourvote.org. We also have grassroots field poll monitoring programs, serving voters in their community, and we use litigation when and where necessary to make sure that we're protecting the right to vote. On the next slide, some of the highlights of the Election Protection Coalition are we've recruited and mobilized over 12,000 grassroots and legal volunteers. We have our national call center, typically in DC, but also a series of local call centers. Our hotline has received over 200,000 calls, and we have organizing efforts in at least 30 states, including Alabama. These are field programs, voter education, poll worker recruitment, and as mentioned, litigation. So on the next slide, So I do want to say that programmatically we have been impacted by COVID-19. Our national hotline is now going completely remote, something that we've been able to do. And we have local command centers that kind of focus on election day that are also remote, but allowing us to deal with tickets that are coming up that we're getting calls about, and working with partners to reach out to election officials. Our poll monitors program are largely working from their vehicles and roving poll monitors, and we've stepped up our social media engagement. And so now I want to turn to China to talk more about the particular impacts that COVID-19 has had on the election and on students.
Hello, everybody. My name is China Baldwin. I serve as the Senior National Coordinator for Election Protection. I use she, her pronouns, and basically my role is to coordinate election protection in 5 different states. So I'm currently in Alabama, Michigan, Louisiana, South Carolina. And so I really want to talk to you all about COVID's impact specifically on college voters. So up here, you'll see a list of instances that have affected our election process. Some of them are unique to students, but a lot of them have impacted all of us. So if you actually could go to the next slide, I'm going to share a little bit about some state-specific examples of how these things have showed up. So starting with voter registration, COVID's impact has had a varying array of impact, specifically in states that don't have same-day voter registration. So something that we saw in Florida was that because they have SDR, it did make it a little bit easier. So when students are, so students were registering at their college and university. And so essentially if they moved, and so if they got displaced, they got displaced because of COVID, what we found is that registration was really impacting them. There was no way for them to get re-registered unless the state offered SDR. So Florida, that was a good point. The only thing that didn't impact was for folks that were out of state. And really in general, out of state students kind of get left out of college advocacy, simply because when you're in a specific school, if there's folks that are coming from different states, there's varying election law. So as far as the process for absentee ballots, it's already kind of complicated, but obviously the impact of COVID has made things a little more complex. Even pre-COVID, education around absentee voting was a challenge, especially for out-of-state students, like I said. Then when you go into mixing the impact of the fact that many students don't have access to internet and printing, they rely on campus, that's definitely made things a little bit more challenging. ID is also a pre-COVID issue, so I shared some examples here about Texas and Wisconsin. But for a lot of states, the absentee ballot process requires folks to show their ID like via scanning, so that's continued to be an issue as well. Something that we're also finding is that a number of states are adopting entirely vote-by-mail systems, which is great because it obviously does kind of respond to some of those health concerns, but it definitely ignores some of the accessibility issues. So there's one, just language access, actual physical accessibility, but as well as I mentioned, the ability to actually use the internet and or printing services as well. So those are just a number of impacts specific to college students. Like I said, there are some things that are impacting voters all across, but these are just some things that are specifically challenging to college voters. Next slide. So on here, I shared some questions to consider. So these are things for student advocates, organizers, and organizations to consider when you're thinking about your advocacy for COVID and how you want to continue to engage college students, even in this current state that we're in. So the biggest question and the biggest thing that we're having to kind of ponder is the balance between access and safety. So what does it look like to make sure students have access to the ballot, but they're not having to compromise their safety? And something that we're finding is many folks are opting to go with entirely vote-by-mail systems. And while, like I said before, it does definitely have some benefits when it comes to safety. Folks are able to have a little bit more time looking over their ballot. They're in the safety of their homes. It doesn't take into account a variety of problems specific for college students. Some other things to consider are whether or not the advocacy adds any additional problems. So we're also seeing folks that are thinking through some unique ways to make sure folks are having access to the ballot. But some of those solutions that we're seeing actually are adding more problems, more confusion, and the already back and forth of pending litigation and changes, it's making things a little bit more complex and confusing. So we want to make sure any advocacy that we're constructing is taking into account how that's going to actually impact students. And something that I just wanted to share is that we actually have a blog post on our 866rvote.org site. We have a blog post called Defending Democracy. And so it's under the newsroom section, and you can find out some more resources and information on creating advocacy that keeps in mind access and safety. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Armani.
Thank you, China. Hi, everyone. My name is Armani Edie. I am an election protection organizer here at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I have the amazing honor and opportunity to organize in Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, and Michigan. I'm excited to address you all today and also contribute to this presentation. I wanted to go over what you, students, can do to get involved in election protection work. And before I dive in onto what you can do from home and eventually when you return to your campuses, I also want to point out that election protection anybody can be involved in it. So when we are thinking about our undocumented brothers and sisters and also our formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters, I want to keep in mind that they too can engage in election protection as we continue to fight for their right to vote and restoring their voting rights. So I wanted to quickly go through what you can do. The first is detect and alert. So finding out about voting changes happening in your community. I know there are a lot of sessions that have been postponed, but if you know that your Board of Elections or your City Council are meeting and they're meeting virtually, that's a time that you can tap in and really take notes about what's happening and keeping note of any changes that may happen. If you need additional support, you can record it and let us know by emailing or calling us over at 866-OUR-VOTE. We're live 365, and right now we're open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And so we'll take your questions as well. Another thing that can help is identifying county election officials who can be able to help us troubleshoot voting issues. My colleague China and I will be organizing in Alabama this election season, and so we want to know everyone who's involved in making voting changes, and so that will help us navigate that as well. Again, contacting the Lawyers Committee and seeing if the community needs additional support, whether that's, I don't know if my ballot got to, the Board of Elections or the county clerk's office. We want to make sure that we're assisting you all throughout the year. And then also, my favorite is education. So voter education is very important, especially for students. I was recently a student myself, and so I understand the importance of having community, and right now we have to find different ways to connect. So we encourage you all to host a Know Your Voting Rights party, whether that's via Zoom, Google Hangouts. Right now, my favorite DJ D Nice on Instagram, if you all know who he is, has something called Club Quarantine. You could do that. You could adapt that to a voting rights, Know Your Voting Rights party. And if you all would like to extend us an invitation, I know China and I would not shy away from attending. So please let us know. And then lastly, follow us on 866-OUR-VOTE. You can repost and retweet voting information. We update that literally every day. And so we want to make sure that you have these tools in your vessel to use while you're at home and hopefully when you get back on campus. Next slide, please. And so the last thing we kind of want to talk about is the legislative response, specifically in Alabama, in light of COVID. And so House Bill 165 would make it so each county has to notify voters if their absentee ballots weren't counted. This is really important, considering that if we're pushing vote by mail, we want to ensure that every voter has confidence that their vote has been counted. And so that's pending in the legislature as well. House Bill 28 would make it so there was no excuse required for absentee ballot voting. Currently in Alabama, an excuse is required to fill out the form and receive an absentee ballot. So this would make it so you didn't have to go through all of that. You can just request the absentee ballot and have your ballot mailed to you. And House Bill 30 would require each county to provide at least one early vote location for 14 days prior to an election day. And so that's also important because you're giving people a little bit more time to cast their vote. And so these are a few ways that the Alabama legislature is working to remedy these problems, and hopefully we see some progress here. But this is an example of how we keep a documentation of what's happening, and encourage you all to do the same. Next slide, please. So that is it. Again, we want to thank you all so much for allowing us to have the time to address you all about the most critical issue when it comes to voting rights. You can follow China and I via Instagram. I see my Instagram, and Twitter is the same. It's at Armani Edie, and also following China. We update things with voting rights and keep up with our advocacy there. And also feel free to reach out to us via email, and we're quick to respond. So again, thank you all, and I'm excited to see the next presentation.
Thank you, Rance, China, and Armani, for that presentation. Next, we'll hear from Katie Glenn, who is a policy associate for Southern Poverty Law Center. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Representative Gray, and I'm gonna put myself on video because I do not have a presentation to do, so you will just have to look at me while I talk. But I am so thankful to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit about the importance of absentee voting, especially within this election. As Representative Gray said, my name is Katie Glenn. I'm a policy associate at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And what that means is I work with all these fine folks on this phone to advance our policy initiatives in the Alabama legislature, along with many of our amazing coalition partners and community partners who we work with on the ground. So I wanted to talk to begin with about sort of the state of absentee voting in Alabama, where it is right now, and then talk some about recent legislation, current legislation that's pending in front of the legislature, and then a little bit just about the state of voting in Alabama more broadly, and I'll do all of that in about 10 minutes. So it's important to know, first of all, that of course students are going to have to rely heavily across Alabama and across the country on absentee voting during the 2020 elections, like many of us will. But also to note that students can register to vote at your residence on campus if you so choose during the school year, and that the voter registration deadline every year for every election is 15 days before any election. In Alabama, one of the few ways that we are ahead of the game here when it comes to voting is that you can register to vote online. You can also do so via paper registration. So just wanted to mention that briefly. Currently in Alabama, in order to vote via absentee ballot, you have to submit an absentee ballot application to the office of the absentee election manager. It's different in every county. You can look it up, but it's not always the same place. No later than the 5th day prior to the election. Now you can submit that via mail, or you can go and do that in person. Obviously can't really go and do that in person right now, but in pre-COVID times, you could go and submit your application, have your ballot handed back to you, and vote via your absentee ballot in person. For me, I would just go down to the office in downtown Montgomery, get my application, vote via absentee ballot, hand it right back. But you can also do this whole process via mail as well. If you do it via mail, your ballot has to be returned by mail, has to be postmarked no later than the day prior to the election, and then received back by the election manager no later than noon on actual election day, or it can be hand delivered by 5 p.m. on election day as well. As China mentioned, Alabama is actually one of the states where a copy of your voter ID has to be submitted with your application for an absentee ballot and with your actual absentee ballot. And I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but you might have actually seen a little bit of a dust up between our Secretary of State and a voter that then Sherilyn Eifel from NAACP Legal Defense Fund tweeted about, where the voter was concerned that there will be less access to the technology necessary right now to scan, copy, and print a copy of his voter ID to include in his absentee ballot application right now, and send in so that he can vote in the runoff election in July. And it's a really important point, right? Because I don't know about y'all, I don't have a scanner in my house. I have a really old, not very functioning printer. We depend on the printers that we use at our offices. My husband and I are working from home right now. And the suggestion that folks just go to, I think the suggestion was that somebody just go to a Kinko's is not particularly helpful when people are trying to take care of their personal and family health. So, it's providing an additional barrier for people when it comes to absentee voting. So I thought that was important that China had mentioned that. There are a wide range of people, including students, who can absentee vote in Alabama. And as of 2019, thanks to a bill that was authored by Senator Smitherman in the Senate Democratic Caucus, that includes people who are currently, it explicitly includes on the absentee ballot application, people who are currently incarcerated in prisons and jails, who were not convicted of crimes of moral turpitude. Previously, there were some provisions under which people in jails could vote, but now people who are incarcerated in prisons can vote as well via absentee ballot. So that's just sort of absentee voting generally. So I want to talk through just very briefly what the absentee ballot application looks like in Alabama, because I think this is really important because it's pretty onerous, right? I don't know how many of you have actually tried to vote via absentee before, but it's pretty confusing. So when I think it was Armani was going through some of the legislation that's pending, and we'll go through more of it in a minute, but there are a lot of ways, a lot of excuses that you have to check off in order to vote via absentee ballot in Alabama. And some of them are pretty intense. And you have to swear, you have to sign your name that one of these is true, right? So I expect to be out of the country or the state on election day. I have a physical illness or infirmity which prevents my attendance at the polls. There's about 10 of these excuses that you can use. And then you have to sign your name, and there are various penalties that you can be charged with if you knowingly or unlawfully vote via absentee ballot. Which is why there are some folks who are pushing for no excuse absentee voting, which would just remove all of these excuses that are currently required to vote via absentee. Because again, this is just one more barrier that people face when they try to go and vote via absentee ballot in Alabama. So moving into recent legislation. In 2019, there were a couple of important pieces to know about that actually passed. HB 174 by Representative Gaston, who is the pro tem in the House from the Mobile area, allowed permanently disabled voters to automatically receive absentee ballots. There are some hurdles in that bill that require various authorizations by doctors, but that's one piece of legislation. And then Senate Bill 301, which I mentioned previously, that allowed for people currently incarcerated in jails and prisons to vote via absentee ballot. It did several other things as well. It actually modified those excuses that we talked about earlier, because before that, when you were filling out an absentee ballot, you actually had to swear that you would be out of town, you would be working, or you would be unable to get to the polls for some reason or another. But now, thanks to that bill, you only have to swear that you expect to be out of town, working, unable to get to the polls, which is an important distinction, right? Because I may not actually know 15 days out what my work schedule looks like for that day. I may not know what my travel is going to be. I may expect to know, but I may not feel comfortable swearing on an official government document that I will be traveling for school, that my class schedule will require me to be on campus all day, that, a currently tentative class outing. You may be, you know, expecting to come to Montgomery in a world where we are once again traveling out of city for some, you know, school engagement. You know, that modification to the legislation was very important. And then it added another provision, which was that someone who was a caregiver for a family member could vote via absentee, which will be increasingly important in the world that we currently find ourselves in, because there are a lot of folks who are going to find themselves in that caregiver position. And then in terms of current legislation, there are a few other ones, including the ones that Armani mentioned, that I wanted to go over with y'all. HB 28 by Representative Jackson is the no excuse absentee bill. It would remove all of those excuses and allow anyone to vote via absentee ballot. And this is a really, really important piece of legislation. I think this is at least the second year Representative Jackson has brought it. I only say at least the second year because I've only been working on it a couple years. He's likely brought it many more years than that, because this is an issue that he's cared about very deeply for a very long time, and we are very thankful for that. But this would allow anyone to vote via absentee. We shouldn't have to tell the state why one of their few approved excuses are going to keep us from the polls that day, because things come up. We all have familial and work and personal obligations that might keep us from the polls, and we need to be able to exercise our right to vote without having to jump through all of these additional hoops. HB 50 by Representative Laura Hall would expand the list of eligible identifications for absentee voting to include an inmate identification card. And that is the name of the card that incarcerated people receive in the facility that they're in. And so for lots of incarcerated people, they may not have a driver's license or a non-driver's license state ID or whatever with them in that facility, but may still have their right to vote and have with them this other state issued ID, which certainly shows who they are, the inmate identification card. And now that the SB 301 from last year has expanded their access to absentee voting, Representative Hall's bill would just allow that they use that card that we know that everyone inside of those ADOC facilities should have. ADOC, excuse me, being the Alabama Department of Corrections. HB 165, Armani went over with you. HB 256, this is an interesting one. This removes the notarization requirement for absentee, or the witnessing requirement for absentee ballots submitted by members of the military. So this is another hoop that people have to jump through to vote via absentee ballot. If you pull up the absentee ballot application, there's a requirement that people voting that way have a witness or a notarization, a witness signature or notarization on that ballot. But members of the military don't have to have that. This bill is one of the few voting bills that actually started moving this year before the legislature had to adjourn due to COVID. But my question would be, if members of the military don't need this witnessing requirement, why does everyone else? Why can't we remove it for the rest of the voting public? In the Senate side, there's a companion bill to that, sponsored by Senator Whatley, same bill, SB 180. And then there is Senator Singleton, who's on the phone. So I'll hopefully describe his bill correctly. SB 246. This would require that that if anyone were to get their absentee ballot rejected, that they be notified and sent a provisional ballot with instructions on how to remedy the deficiency. So currently, if your absentee ballot is rejected, once you send in the actual ballot, you're not necessarily notified. There are mechanisms by which you can inquire for that and get that information, but you have to be proactive about it. And so this would actually allow you to be notified, sent a provisional ballot, and have an explanation for how to fill out the ballot correctly. As I mentioned previously, many of these, unfortunately, didn't get a chance to get moving in the legislature before they adjourned due to the COVID crisis. And now the legislature is coming back next week and has a whole lot on their plate with not a lot of time left to move. And so my request to all of you students who are such wonderful and energetic activists would be to call upon certainly your elected officials, but also Governor Ivey, and let her know that we don't have time to waste. We are in the midst of a crisis, certainly, but what we are about to be in the midst of is a crisis of voting. We see what is happening across the country. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. And we know that if students and other Alabamians don't have full access to no excuse absentee voting, to mail-in ballots, that our literal lives will be at risk. So I think this is a really good opportunity, and I know we're going to talk about student activism around absentee voting and voting in general here in a minute, but this is just another opportunity to plug in. And then just very quickly, I wanted to plug a couple more things for you. A couple more ways just to learn more about voting more broadly in Alabama and in the Southeast. We all know on this line that voter suppression is alive and well in the country, in the Southeast, and in Alabama. SCLC recently published a report specifically about voter suppression in Alabama that I shared with Katie and Jordan, and I think they are going to share it in the chat or share it out with attendees somehow. If you wanted to read up on that, it's got a lot more information than what I was able to share today. And then additionally, one of the most high profile and potentially most impactful cases on voting in the country is happening right now. And because of the situation that we find ourselves in, where everyone is, working remotely as they can, you're able to listen in. So the Jones v. DeSantis trial, which is the trial over the Amendment 4 fines and fees situation in Florida, where Florida voters passed a ballot initiative that restored people's rights to vote. And then the Florida legislature followed up and said that their right to vote could only be restored if they paid off all their fines and fees, is currently being litigated by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU of Florida, the Brennan Center, the Campaign Legal Center, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you can actually call in and listen to that litigation. And so we've got information with the dial-in number and the access code that we are also going to share out in case that's something that would be of interest to you. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope some of that information was helpful. Look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to your questions.
Thank you so much, Katie, for the presentation. While the presentation was going on, I think that Representative Clark put in that the Secretary of State office said, during the July 14th primary runoff, if you are afraid or prefer not to go to the polls because of COVID-19, you can actually check the box. I have a physical illness, infirmity that prevents my attendance at the poll. So if you don't want to go to the poll, that's one way to, that's what you should check if you don't want to go to the poll on the July 14th runoff. Next, we'll hear from a student perspective, Benjamin Leonard. He's a graduate student from the University of Alabama, and he just graduated this year. So we want to give him a Zoom congratulations. And he is with, he's a part of Andrew Goodman Foundation. Welcome, Benjamin.
Thanks, Representative Gray. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Katie, and our friends at the Lawyers Committee for your presentations. I certainly learned a lot. And thank you to the Democratic Caucus for hosting this nonpartisan forum. As Representative Gray said, I'm here to give my view as a student about voting during COVID. But I first wanted to talk about my role at the University of Alabama with the Andrew Goodman Foundation. So if we can go to the next slide, I work with Vote Everywhere UA, which is a campus chapter of the National Andrew Goodman Foundation, which supports leadership development and voting accessibility and works to make young voices and votes a powerful force in the United States. So here on this slide, I've outlined a few numbers and statistics about AGF, just to give you an overview of the scope of the foundation. On campus, Vote Everywhere UA works to register voters, give them election information, and just generally get people involved in their college community. And on this next slide, I also wanted to share and brag on some AGF teams across the country who have had some really impactful wins in the past few years. So if you can read here, A couple of different campuses have secured early or election day on-campus polling places, which is really helpful for a lot of students who have busy class schedules and maybe can't drive several miles off campus. It's much more convenient, obviously, to have a polling place near you. Other campuses have advocated for legislative changes to allow student IDs to be used as voter IDs. And then Georgia State University also secured 100% student staffed on-campus polling place for their primary election. And just on the next slide as well, there are a few more things that I wanted to point out. Alabama A&M, we are thankful that they are on the call today and have helped us set up this webinar. They institutionalize voter registration in first-year classes. So over the course of a year, they registered about 1,300 voters, which is very impressive. And we're thankful for all of these efforts, especially in southern states where there's traditionally been barriers to young people and plenty of other groups to voting. But on the next slide, I'll kind of get into the COVID part of my presentation. So these are common barriers that we see to students voting during normal times. And each of these barriers is only exacerbated during a global pandemic. The absentee ballot process, which Katie mentioned and which the Lawyers Committee mentioned, can be difficult to navigate, especially in states like Alabama. And in November, it's possible that the absentee ballot system will be overwhelmed just because of the increased number of people trying to use it. And on my third point here on misinformation, it's not always that elections officials are broadcasting mixed or contradictory messages. It's just the fact that with this health crisis that we're under, things are changing. The dates of elections are changing, the voting options are changing, there are pending lawsuits. So even if elected officials and elections officials are putting out thorough guidance, voters may not see it or they might not hear it. And especially for us college students, if we normally vote in our college community and we have to go home, maybe out of state or to a different community in state, we just might not hear what's going on locally. So it's not always the case that voter suppression or disenfranchisement is overt. It's often the case that in times like these, the ways that votes are suppressed is just a lot of change going on at one time. On this next slide, I outline 4 categories of students. And this is kind of how I like to break it down when we're thinking about groups to reach on campus. So each of these students is likely to face different obstacles in registering to vote and accessing the ballot box. For example, student number 4, if they want to register in Alabama, which they can do if they're coming here for school, and if they want to do it online, they need to get an Alabama driver's license. And if they don't have that, or they want to keep their driver's license from their home state, they'd have to take the time out of their day to print off a voter registration form, fill it out, mail it in. And assuming they filled it out correctly, they'd be registered in their college community. But if they didn't fill it out correctly, if they made an error, they would need to find that out and submit additional information to their county board of registrars. And you can imagine a scenario in which a student is in a rush to get registered for an upcoming election, fills out a form incorrectly, and then may not be able to get registered before the deadline. Then when you're thinking about students 1 and students 3, they would have to go through the absentee ballot process. Student 1, of course, going specifically through Alabama's absentee ballot process, which, as Katie explained, can be a bit difficult. And then student 4, if they want to vote in the July elections coming up, they will also have to go through the absentee ballot process since many students are home for the summer or away from campus. And on this next slide, I have outlined some of my concerns, some of Vote Everywhere's concerns about student voting during COVID. As was pointed out, the Alabama Secretary of State has announced that any voter can vote using an absentee ballot during the COVID-19 outbreak in the July elections. There's, of course, the Republican Senate runoff and a number of local races. This is definitely a step in the right direction, but in my opinion, even under normal circumstances, voters should be able to vote absentee with no excuse. But as far as I know, nothing concrete has been put in place for November's election in Alabama, though other states are already preparing. So these concerns are definitely valid for July's elections as well as November's. But you can see, I mean, none of these things on its own under the absentee ballot category may totally block a student from being able to vote absentee, but it's really in the aggregate that these barriers or these hoops might just, might cause a student to say, you know what, this isn't worth it. This is a lot of time out of my day. I'm a busy person. And so anything that we can do as citizens and the legislators on the line to take away these hoops, to take away these obstacles, will just encourage more people to get out there and to absentee vote. And then for the in-person voting point, I'm glad that Katie brought up Wisconsin, because if you all have been following it, Wisconsin had a number of state and local races that happened just a couple of weeks ago. And elections officials before the election were saying, no, everything's totally fine, just go and vote like normal. And of course, a lot of polling places were closed because of COVID. And so you had pictures of hundreds of people standing in lines with gloves and masks on. And of course, in that instance, people caught coronavirus with all of those people concentrated in one place. So we're just really concerned that if Alabama doesn't prepare for November for the general election, people will be scared to vote, and they won't vote. And I think the reality of the current situation means that several groups, in particular, like the elderly, people experiencing poverty, people living in rural areas with pre-existing medical conditions, college students, will be disproportionately impacted during an election held during the outbreak. So on this next slide, when Vote Everywhere started thinking through all those issues, we decided to make our opinions and our proposals known. And many other organizations have written letters like ours. I know the SPLC and the NAACP and the Lawyers Committee have been working on their letters and proposals. But I thought I'd walk everyone through kind of what a few things that we think would be helpful to sustain participation in upcoming elections. And if you just if you have an iPhone or another smartphone and you open your camera and you just hold it over the QR code, it should take you right to the letter. But we think the state of Alabama needs to institute no excuse absentee voting to allow everyone to vote absentee. I think the state should repeal the requirement for 2 witness signatures or a ballot notarization to vote absentee, and then adjust the requirement for submitting a photocopy of a government-issued photo ID to vote absentee, because a lot of people just don't have access to scanners and printers right now. And then I think our friends at the Lawyers Committee pointed out that even if absentee voting is available for everyone, a lot of states will want to offer an in-person option, which is why we think Alabama should adopt 2 weeks of early voting. That's not a service we have now, but we think if you could theoretically, spread in-person voter participation out over a couple weeks, it would prevent, an election day mess where everyone shows up to the polling place at the same time. And then another thing that other states have done that would be useful here is to send all eligible voters in the state a mail ballot or an absentee ballot request form. I know Georgia's doing this, and several other states, even some southern states are doing this or are considering doing this. And we sent this letter to 6 state officials and the head of both the Republican and the Democratic Party here in the state. And we hope that they'll consider and maybe act on our best interests. And on this next slide, I wanted to outline what you could do and how you could get involved in maybe sending your own letter, advocating for proposals that you think would make you feel safest to vote. And in my limited experience with legislators, even at the national level, many don't get too many calls about specific issues that come up. Obviously, there's a lot going on now, so you'd expect, the volume of constituents interacting with their legislators to go up. But you could imagine that if a majority of Alabama state legislators got even a couple of calls or emails with these proposals, they would take them seriously. And I know a lot of people have probably never called or emailed their representatives before, but there's definitely no reason to be scared of it. Just a short, polite, direct email or phone call will get your point across. And you can see here a couple of proposals that I've already mentioned, and just kind of outlining them and personalizing them and making them unique to your own story and your situation. Making your voice heard that way can definitely be impactful. On this next slide, a few of these resources have been given before, but I just wanted to highlight them. AlabamaVotes.gov is a great resource, has much of the information you need to know to get ready to vote, to request an absentee ballot. The Election Protection Hotline is another great resource. There's a website called myvoteeverywhere.org, which is geared toward college students. And if you've never requested an absentee ballot before, Vote Everywhere UA put together a short YouTube video which kind of walks you through the process. It was more geared toward the primary election back in February, but much of the information is still the same. And I also wanted to share this opportunity for students listening. If you think that your ability to vote might be compromised due to the coronavirus, please consider sharing your story with us, just for our advocacy efforts and for our partners' advocacy efforts. Personal stories really do have an effect in convincing legislators to take up proposals. And lastly, on this last slide, I just wanted to share our contact information, our Twitter handle. We're always looking for new partners, new ideas, and ways to deepen our impact. So if you'd like to connect, please reach out. And thank you all for listening. I hope you all stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, Benjamin, and all the panelists for the great information. We will now open it up for Q&A. I have a few questions that were sent to me. If I'm a college student and back home, would you recommend me changing the polling place to match?
So what I would do if you're a college student and you are back home, what I would do is request an absentee ballot if you're thinking about voting in the July elections. For November, the situation is definitely in flux because we don't know if people will be able to vote with no excuse. But if you're home for the summer and you're registered in your college community, I would recommend voting absentee.
And one more question. When is the deadline for a ballot to be mailed in to be mailed in or received by my state for the primary runoff?
So the runoff is July 14th. And if you are looking to request an absentee ballot, you have to request it at least 5 days before. You can actually request it more than that. I can't remember when the portal to request it actually opens, but all of that information is on the Secretary of State's website, which is alabamavotes.gov, but at least 5 days before, and then you have to have it postmarked by the day before, so that would be July 13th, and it has to be received by noon on the 14th. So you'd probably be better off giving yourself a little bit more of a window than that, but the deadline is to have it postmarked by July 13th.
Yeah, and I just wanted to hop in on that. I believe you can go ahead and request your absentee ballot now for the July elections. And it's just my thought that since so many more people will be voting absentee in July, that the system might be a little bit overwhelmed. So it'd be better if you didn't wait and went ahead and requested your absentee ballot now.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we've got in the Q&A and in the chat. I would like just to open the floor for anybody in leadership, Representative Daniels or Senator Singleton. Do they want to have any closing remarks, or even Representative Clark? If none, I would just like to close it out by just saying thank you to all the organizations, the panelists, the staff for putting this webinar together. We know that it's a pivotal moment for voting. And as young people, millennials, one of the biggest populations, we have to do our part. And we can't be bound by restraints as far as not being able to go to the ballot. And so I would just encourage you all to share this information and make sure you vote. And that's all that I have. You have anything, Katie?
I do not. Senator Singleton, I see you've opened your mic. Do you have anything?
Oh, no, thank you. I just want to thank everybody for coming. I think there's been some great information today pertaining absentee ballot voting. And we as a legislature has a lot of work to do. As Katie talked about earlier, there's a lot of bills that are in the hopper that probably won't be taken up in these last few days of the legislative session and will not affect our November election. But we must get on board to try to at least push the governor into a special session just to deal with some of these issues that we have, just to make sure that everybody have the right to access the vote.
Thank you. I think that sums it up well. And we did have 2 questions about the slides, and we will talk with the panelists, and if we get permission, we will share it with with all of the ones who have registered for this webinar. And we thank you for joining us, and this ends our webinar for today.
Thank you.